Reading from The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, Volume 2, a Seth book. Session 713. Okay, so Seth states, it might help here if you imagine the psyche again as some multidimensional living television set. In what seems to be the small space of the screen, many programs are going on, though you can tune in to only one at a time. In a manner of speaking, however, all of the other programs are quote-unquote latent in the one you are watching. There are coordinates that unite them all. There is a give and take quite invisible to you between one program and another, and action within one, again, affects the action within each of the others. Like this imaginary multidimensional television, the psyche contains within it other programs than the one in which you are acting, other plots, environments, and world situations. Theoretically, you can indeed momentarily, quote, walk out of, end quote, momentarily walk out of your program into another as easily, when you know how, as you now move from one room to another. You must know that the other programs exist, or the possibility of such action would not occur to you. In larger terms, all of the programs are but portions of one. The various sets are real, however, and the characters quite alive. Now, actors playing parts are obviously alive as actors, but in a fictional play, for example, the characters portrayed by the actors are not alive in your terms, in the same fashion that the actors are. In the psyche, however, and in its greater reality, the characters have their own lives, quite as real as those of the actors. Think again of the psyche in the manner mentioned, taking it for granted that the program now on the screen is a fully dimensioned reality, and that hidden somewhere in its very elements are all of the other programs not showing. These are not lined up in space behind the quote-unquote front program, but in a completely different way contained within it. The point of any image at any given time in the picture showing might represent, for example, a top hat on a table. Everyone acting in that scene would view the hat and the table and react accordingly with their own individual characteristics. The hat on the table, while possessing all of the necessary paraphernalia of reality for that scene, might also, however, serve as a different kind of reference point for one of the other programs simultaneously occurring. In that reality, say program 2, the entire configuration of hat and table may be meaningless, while still being interpreted in an entirely different way from a quite different perspective. There, in program 2, the table might be a flat, natural plane, and the hat an oddly shaped structure upon it, a natural rather than a manufactured one. Objects in your reality have an entirely different aspect in another. Any of the objects shown in the program you are watching, then, may be used as a different kind of reference point in another reality, in which those objects appear as something else. So Seth's saying to bear with him because he's trying to make an analogy on two levels. He goes on, he says, in terms of your psyche, each of your own thoughts and actions exist not only in the manner in which you are familiar with them, but also in many other forms that you do not perceive. forms that may appear as natural events in a different dimension than your own, as dream images, and even as self-propelling energy. No energy is ever lost. The energy within your own thoughts, then, does not dissipate, even when you yourself have finished with them. Their energy has reality in other worlds. Now, imagine that the picture on the television screen shows you your own universe. Your idea of space would be to send a ship from one planet, Earth, outward into the rest of space that you perceive on that quote-unquote flat screen. Even with your projected technology, this would involve great elements of time. Imagine here now that the screen's picture is off-centered to begin with, so that everything is distorted to some extent, and going out into space seems to be going backward into time. If the picture were magically centered, then all quote-unquote time, all time would be seen to flow out from the instant moment of perception, the private now. And in many ways, the mass now, or mass perception, represents the overall now point of your planet. From that now, quote-unquote time goes out in all probable directions. Actually, it also goes inward in all probable directions. The simple picture of the universe that you see on our screen, therefore, represents a view from your own now perspective. But each star, planet, galaxy, or whatever is made up of other reference points, in which, to put it simply, the same patterns have different kinds of reality. True space travel would, of course, be time-space travel, in which you learned how to use points in your own universe as, quote, dimensional clues, end quote, as dimensional clues that would serve as entry points into other worlds. Otherwise, you are simply flying like an insect around the outside of the television set, trying to land on the fruit, say, that is shown upon the screen, and wondering, like a poor bemused fly, why you cannot. You use one main focus in your reality. In the outside world, this means that you have a, quote, clear picture, end quote. There is no snow. That physical program is the one you are acting in, alive in, and it is the one shown on the screen. The screen is the part of your psyche upon which you are concentrating. You not only tune in to the picture, but you also create the props, the entire history of the life and times, but in living three-dimensional terms, and quote-unquote you are within that picture. The kind of reality thus created by that portion of your consciousness forms a given kind of experience. It is valid and real. When you want to travel, you do so within the dimensions of the reality thus created. If you drive or fly from one city to another, you do not consider the journey imaginary. You are exploring the dimensions given. Now, if you alter that picture a little so that the images are somewhat scrambled, and you do this by altering the focus of your consciousness, then the familiar coordination is gone. Objects may appear blurred, ordinary sounds distorted. It seems as if you are on the outskirts of your own reality. In such a state, however, it is easy to see that your usual orientation may be but one of many frames of reference. If you did change the focus of your consciousness still further, you might then, quote, bring in, end quote, you might then bring in another picture entirely. On the outside, this would give you another reality. In it, your quote-unquote old reality might still be somewhat perceivable as a ghost image if you knew what to look for and remembered your former coordinates. On the inside, however, you would be traveling not around or about, but through one portion of the psyche with its reality into another portion of the psyche with its reality. That kind of journey would not be any more imaginary than a trip from one city to another. There are space-time coordinates that operate from your viewpoint, and space travel from the standpoint of your time, made along the axis of your space, will be a relatively sterile procedure. Some reported instances of UFOs happened in the past as far as the visitors were concerned, but appeared as images or realities in your present. This involves craft sightings only. Okay, right there's an asterisk. He's saying, refer to Appendix 20. Seth goes on. He states, when you change your ordinary television set from one station to another, you may encounter snow or distortion. If something is wrong with the set, you may simply tune in patterns that seem meaningless and carry no particular program. You may have sound without a picture, and sometimes even a picture but sound from another program. So when you begin to experiment with states of altered consciousness, you often run into the same kind of phenomena when nothing seems to make sense. Okay, pausing really fast. This has happened to me so many times, you guys, that the nothing seems to make sense. In deep states of meditation, when I hear voices, it is literally like hearing all these different channels, different sounds of voices, man, woman, child, just like moving the dial on a radio is pretty crazy. So that's something that I obviously need to hone. But anyways, let's continue. So Seth states, currently, physicists have made some important breakthroughs, but they do not recognize their significance. The universe that you know is full of microscopic black holes and white holes, for example. Since your scientists have themselves given these labels, then using those terms, I will say that there are red, green, orange, and purple holes. That is, the so-called black holes and white holes only represent what physicists have so far deduced about the deeper properties of your universe and the way that certain coordinate points in one world operate as providing feed-through into another. Okay, so I don't know if that was supposed to be bleed through, but it says feed through. However, both can make sense. So we'll just go with feed through here. And Seth goes on, nothing exists outside the psyche, however. That does not exist within it. And there is no unknown world that does not have its psychological or psychic counterpart. Man learned to fly as he tried to exteriorize inner experience, for in out-of-body states, in dreams, he had long been familiar with flight. All excursions into outer reality come as the psyche attempts to reproduce in any given quote-unquote exterior world the inner freedom of its being. Men have also visited other worlds through the ages. Others have visited your world, in dreams and in altered states through history as you accept it. Men have been taken upon such journeys. On their return, they almost always interpreted their experiences in terms of their home programs, intertwining what happened into what ended up as great myths and stories, real but not real. Here's some interesting notes if you guys want to pause and read it, and then I'm just going to continue. So Seth goes on, he says, while all of this may sound quite esoteric, it is highly practical, and we are dealing with the nature of creativity itself. Your thoughts, for example, and your intents have their own validity and force. You set them into motion, but then they follow their own laws and realities. All creativity comes from the psyche. I recently suggested a project to Rupert's class, one that will ultimately illuminate many of the points I am making in Unknown Reality. I suggested that Rupert's students create a quote-unquote city at another level of reality. This is not to be a pie-in-the-sky sort of thing, or some quote-unquote heaven hanging suspended above, but a very valid meeting place between worlds. A psychic marketplace, for example, where ideas are exchanged. A place of psychic commerce. A pleasant environment with quite definite coordinates. Established as an, quote, orbiting satellite, end quote. Established as an orbiting satellite on the outskirts of your world. Initially, all worlds are created in just that fashion. Again, pause. I love doing this. I love creating little cities or worlds. Literally, I can find them in just about anything. Just about anything. I mean, really anything. But it's fun to do. You guys gotta definitely try that if you haven't already. Here's the city that Seth talks about. He says, in certain terms then, this involves, in a very small way, the creation and colonization of a different kind of reality. Consciously accepted, however, from your perspective. On an unconscious level, the world as you know it expands in just such a fashion. Several students have had dreams involving their participation in such a project. Rupert found himself in an out-of-body state looking at a jacket. It had 4 rectangular pockets. It was giant-sized. As he looked at it, the front flap was open. In the dream, he flew through this flap literally into another dimension, where the point of the flap was a hill upon which he landed. From that second perspective, the pockets of the jacket in the first perspective became the windows of a building that existed in a still further third dimension beyond the hill. Standing on the hill, he knew that in perspective 1, the windows of the building in perspective 3 were jacket pockets, but he could no longer perceive them as such. Looking out from the hill in perspective 2, perspective 1 was invisibly behind him, and perspective 3 was still quote-unquote ahead of him, separated from him by a gulf he did not understand. He knew, however, that if the shades were pulled in the windows in perspective 3, then the jacket pocket flaps would appear to be closed in perspective 1. He also realized he had been directing the erection of the building in perspective 3 by making the jacket in perspective 1. When he approached the hill in perspective 2, I hope I'm not confusing you guys here, When he approached the hill in perspective 2, he spoke to the contractor who was there before him. Rupert said that he wanted to change the design. The contractor agreed and shouted orders to the people who were working in perspective 3, where the building stood. Now, Rupert was validly involved in the erection of that building, and he did indeed travel through various dimensions, in which the objects in one represented something entirely different in another. He used the particular symbols, however, simply to bring the theory home to him. But it represented the fact that any given object in one dimension has its own reality in another. You cannot move through time and space without altering the focus of your psyche. When you so alter that focus, however, you also change the exterior reality that you then experience. So, they're about to take a break, but Seth says, later you will realize the startling nature of what has been given this evening. The following is for Rupert. This is Seth. The following is for Rupert, yet also for others, and can serve as a brief essay on the nature of will. And Rob stating here that a lot of it was really personal, and so he's not giving all of it. And anything that's in brackets is him tying it together to make sense. So the next video will give you guys that information plus the notes for this chapter, for this session.